Well, welcome back, everyone. So here's the promised talk about the services that we provide. I'll just do a quick plug for this. This whole session is kind of what can OSG Services do for you if you're a research adjacent person doing research or helping people with research. And so I'll be giving this overview of services. There's a couple services that I'm only going to touch on briefly because there are going to be talks about them next in this session. And then we're also going to have a demo of the OS Pool notebooks. If you want to try starting one up yourself, this tiny URL link should go to the notebook page, and you should be able to authenticate with either your campus ID or organizational ID, or I think you can use GitHub as well if your organization isn't on the list. So just if you need something to do during the talk, feel free to check that out. Okay. So diving into OSG services for researchers. So I'm going to start with setting the stage. I have a researcher here who's been doing some work on her laptop, and it's a throughput workload. So for whatever her problem is, she needs to do a bunch of tasks, a bunch of things. And so these are the components of her workload that are going to need to be handled by OSG services. The code and software environment she's using on her laptop, the data she's using and how it's distributed, access to computing capacity to run this large scale workload, and a tool to manage what she's doing. So starting from that last one, it's not a service per se, but the workload manager that we support at OSG Services is primarily the HT Condor software suite. Example submit file on the right here. It has a lot of features for submitting, managing, tracking large scale, high throughput workloads. What's bolded here is some of the highlights for how you can submit hundreds, thousands of tasks or jobs at once. If your workload has sequential components, there's dependencies between the tasks you want to run. There's additional tools, Dagman, part of Condor, Pegasus, builds a lot on Condor that users on our system also use to manage their workload. Okay, so my researcher now has this tool, this software that's going to manage her high throughput workload. Where is she going to manage it from? Well, an access point. So this is a location where you can place your workload to run on some set of resources. Access point may be a new term to some of you. It was defined in a previous talk. Define it again. You can think of it similar to the head node or login node of a compute cluster, but really as I think Brian Bachman said, as a standalone service for accessing the other services that are coming up in a minute. The PATH product operates access points that researchers can use for their work. It's free. You don't need an allocation. There's an account request form you fill in, and you can get access. So what does the access point give you access to? Well, a big piece of that is computing capacity. So this is another component of the workflow or the workload that needs to be addressed. The main service that we run that provides computing capacity is the OS Pool. And it's come up a couple times already today, but it's a federating together of compute resources at different institutions, campuses, national labs, to give the appearance of sort of one big pool of computing capacity. And the one expectation aligned with the idea of high throughput workloads is that individual jobs or tasks are not going to be using multiple servers for one job or task with MPI, but that an individual job can use multiple cores, but is only going to be using one node at a time. Okay. So what's available in the OS Pool? So I ran this yesterday. There's an abundance of CPU cores. There's also quite a few GPUs. So this is the capacity that's available for free without an allocation from one of our access points. And what's a good fit? This gets back to what I was talking about at the beginning. High throughput workload on the OS pool. The ideal is this first column, what I would call a laptop size task, something that takes like 1 core, a few gigabytes of RAM, runs in about half a day, and you want to run hundreds or thousands of those. You can still run things that are a little bit bigger, that use multiple cores, that run for a bit longer. And if you're ever not sure, like, well, I don't know if what I'm running would be a good fit for the OS pool, please contact us, and we're happy to chat about what the suitability is for your particular use case and potential pros and cons of getting started and trying to use the OS pool. So if it turns out that your workload, let's say our researcher with her laptop, her workload is not a perfect fit for the OS pool, maybe she needs a few more cores, maybe she wants to run for a bit longer, we now have the path facility, which I'm not going to talk about in detail because Brian Lynn is going to be doing that next. But this is, you could think of this as another source of computing capacity for high throughput workloads that might not run as comfortably in the current setup of the OS pool. One more source of capacity for our researcher with her workload is bringing your own. Specifically, if you have an access allocation, you can use a resource within that allocation from an access point that we operate. The terminology we use is the idea of an annex, that you create kind of your own little personal pool on this external resource. It shows up as something that you can use, just you, not everybody else on the system. And this has been around for at least a year or two now. We're still rolling out like docs and promotion and making it more widespread. So if you're interested in this, definitely speak to anyone on the facilitation team or Todd Miller, and we can talk to you more about what's involved and if it's a good fit for what you want to do. Okay, so thinking back to our researcher with her workload, she now has a place to put it, the access point. She's going to use Condor, potentially other tools to manage that workload. Through the access point, there are all these different computing capacity options available to her. So now we get to the data component of the workload. Because the OS pool is a distributed system, there's not a shared file system where everything sort of lives. There's this need for inputs to be fetched to wherever the job is executing and outputs to be brought back. This is usually something that's specified in the job description part of the HT Condor submit file. And we support different mechanisms for doing this data movement, getting and putting. Condor has a built-in file transfer mechanism. There's add-on plugins where you can fetch data from, say, a web URL or an S3 bucket. And we also run the Open Science Data Federation as a data distribution service. So this was also touched on in some of the earlier talks, so hopefully this looks a little familiar now, but it's a network. The Open Science Data Federation is a network of data origins, which hopefully, Derek and Frank don't kill me here, but I think of as like a glorified web server where you're putting data that you want to make available to the OSDF, and then there's these caches throughout the federation that are part of what makes it possible to move data at scale, in this case around the OS pool. So what this looks like in the submit file is shown here at the bottom. There's a a special link URL format that will fetch data and can be used to put data back from the origin. And there's usually one associated with an access point. So the access points that we operate all have origins associated with them. So you can use the OSDF for delivering your data to your jobs. And that's all just kind of baked in. One of the other features of the access point. So we don't provide any specific software services. So this is the last component of our researchers' workflow. We've kind of been working our way backwards. Similar to the need to move data, move inputs and outputs as part of managing your workload, we also have to move software environments. We have to have portable software environments. There's a lot of ways to do this. We are definitely moving more and more towards the space of using containers as our primary mechanism for helping researchers create portable software environments and use them in the OS pool or from an access point. And so we support both Docker and Singularity Apptainer. And at the moment are mainly using the file delivery mechanisms described in the previous slide as the tool to some of the tools to help move these environments around. Your software environment in some sense becomes just another input that's part of your job. So it wasn't in my opening slide, but let's suppose our researcher on our laptop has not really used the command line before. So we have one more service for her to run her high throughput workload, and that's OS Pool Notebooks. The slide should look very familiar because it was also in the previous talk, and we're going to have more information about it upcoming. But this is a way for her to access an access point with hopefully very little complication. Just open the link, sign in, and be able to submit jobs. Finally, so I've gone through a bunch of, I guess you could say, technical services for researchers. And so the other service that we provide for researchers is facilitation. So that takes the form of individual orientations, email, office hours, keeping our documentation up to date, training, and providing feedback to developers of these tools so that they can be improved and modified based on what people really need to get done. So this is not a service made up of wires and electronics, but real people. That's also available to researchers who want to get their high throughput workloads running at a large scale. So if you are a researcher or you support researchers and you're like, this all sounds great, what do I do next? Here are some next steps. You can apply for an account and explore documentation for the OS pool and our OS pool access points at the first link there, portal OSG HTC. And same thing for the path facility, the second link. We have a schedule with our upcoming training that you can come to whether or not you have an account. If you want to drop in, there's a registration link from that page. You can test drive HTC computing with a notebook using this link or the short URL that's up on the whiteboard. And at any point, you can email this address. This goes to the facilitation team, and we can talk to you about your workflow, what you want to run, and get you set up with whatever's going to be a good fit for your work.